At 6:14 a.m., the coffee pot sputtered its last breath. The propane heater hummed low. Outside, the Bitterroot Mountains exhaled mist that clung to pine needles like memory. William Granger had just stepped out of his cabin, mug in hand, when he noticed something that made him set it down without taking a sip. Not something. Someone. 30 yards from his porch stood a grizzly bear. Massive, broad-shouldered, but oddly still. She wasn't grazing. She wasn't rummaging. She wasn't aggressive. She was staring at him, not through him, but at him. Deliberate. Calculated. A gaze more precise than instinct, more human than wild. And then he saw why. At her feet, curled in tight like a question mark, lay a cub. Small, too small for this season, breathing shallow, chest twitching but legs motionless. Its golden brown fur was matted with dried blood on the haunch, a jagged wound visible even from Will's distance. He took one step forward. The mother didn't flinch. He took another. She didn't growl, didn't back away. Instead, she lowered her head briefly, almost as if in deference, then nudged the cub forward with her snout. Will froze. He knew grizzlies, had photographed them from the blinds, had seen what a mother could do to a man who simply stood too close. But this wasn't that. This was something else. He didn't have a word for it yet. 15 years ago, maybe he'd have called it instinct, maybe even divine intervention. These days, he didn't believe in either. But what he saw in her eyes, it wasn't desperation. It was trust. And that scared him more than if she'd charged. He knelt slowly, hands visible, not out of fear, but out of something older, reverence. And as he reached the cub, his mind flashed back, not to any bear training manual, not to any field medic procedure, but to the night he lost Lily. His daughter had been 7. The fire had started in the garage, spread fast. Too fast. He'd pulled her out once. She'd run back in for the cat. By the time he reached her the second time, it was too late. Her small hand had rested in his just long enough to twitch once. Then, nothing. The cub stirred beneath him now just slightly. Its paw limp as a wilted flower brushed his wrist the same way. He didn't speak. He didn't cry. He simply acted. Old muscle memory took over. He wrapped the cub in his flannel jacket, felt for a pulse, faint but present. Lifted the body gently, careful of the wound. As he turned toward the cabin, the mother followed close but not intrusive, watching his every movement with the vigilance of a field nurse. Inside, the heat was minimal, the tools outdated, the space cramped. But Will moved like a man who'd been training for this without knowing it. The kitchen table became his operating space. A dusty medkit opened like a relic. The cub's leg had been torn, likely by a trap or barbed wire, too clean for a predator attack, too ragged for a fall. Infection had already begun. Will cleaned the wound, set an IV drip using a leftover pediatric needle, and stitched with hands steadier than they'd been in years. Outside, the grizzly waited. When he looked up after the final stitch, she was staring in through the window. Not moving, just watching. There's a moment in some lives rare and irreversible when the axis of your world tilts by a single degree. You won't see it then, not clearly, but you'll feel it, like a faint click in your chest, and nothing is quite the same after. For Will, that moment was not the stitch. It wasn't even the bear. It was the sound the cub made once the anesthesia wore off, a breath, nothing more. But it was breath, and Will exhaled in response as if holding it in for years. He sat back and looked at the bear through the window. "I did what I could," he whispered. She didn't blink, and maybe it was the sleep deprivation. Maybe it was the cold. But in that moment, Will felt something he hadn't in over a decade, like he mattered again. He didn't know it yet, but everything was about to change. That bear had not come just to save her cub. She'd come to save a man who'd forgotten why he ever saved anything in the first place. The next morning, the cub was still breathing, weak but stable. Will named her Juniper after the tree she was found under. The mother he didn't name. Not yet. Naming things felt dangerous. It implied permanence, and he'd learned the hard way that permanence was a myth. She stayed near the cabin, never more than 50 yards away. She watched every time he stepped outside, not with suspicion, but with the intensity of a parent. And the news traveled faster than the snow melt. 3 cabins down, an old trapper named Vernon spotted the grizzly from his porch and called the ranger station. Within 24 hours, Will had a voicemail from the local wildlife agency. "Call us back. You may have a situation." He didn't. Not yet. What he had was a breathing cub, a curious bear, and for the first time in years, a reason to boil water for something other than instant coffee. Later that day, while adjusting the heating pad beneath Juniper's bed, Will found himself humming. It wasn't a song he recognized, just a rhythm, low, steady, unintentional, and that's when it hit him. He wasn't humming to pass the time. He was humming because something inside him had reawakened, like thawed ground beneath a fading frost. Sometimes the most powerful calls for help come in silence. No sirens, no screams. Just a mother bear standing still on your porch, asking without asking. And sometimes healing doesn't come in a rush. It comes in the simple act of saying yes to someone else's brokenness before your own. People like to believe that wild animals are wild because they're dangerous. But what if they're wild because they trust only what has never failed them? What if the moment an animal risks vulnerability is the clearest sign that something is wrong? Not with them, but with the world they usually avoid. And what if we listened? In that moment, Will didn't tame the bear. He didn't conquer it. He didn't even understand it. He just saw her, and for the first time in years, someone saw him again. But wild trust doesn't come without consequence. As the days passed and the cub recovered, Will would learn just how far a mother would go to protect her child, and how far a man would go to protect the second chance he didn't know he still wanted. And the world outside his cabin, it wasn't ready for any of it. Will Granger had once been the kind of man other people counted on. In a field hospital outside Kandahar, when mortar fire shook the dirt beneath the tents, it was his voice that steadied the young medics. It was his hands, scarred but sure, that pulled soldiers back from the edge. When pain came in waves, when limbs were gone, when breathing was shallow and ragged, Will stayed calm. He stitched, he wrapped. He whispered the kind of quiet words only men who'd seen death could whisper with conviction. But that was a lifetime ago. These days, the only thing Will stitched was his worn flannel shirt when it tore on a fence post. The only wounds he treated were on animals he found injured along the trail. And even those were rare. He didn't go looking anymore. He hadn't set foot in a hospital in nearly 10 years. Not since the night the house caught fire. Not since Lily. Grief doesn't announce itself like a soldier entering a room. It seeps in like winter. You don't realize it's there until your breath fogs the inside of your mind. After the fire, Will had tried to carry on. He stayed in town for 2 more years, let the community bring casseroles. Let his friends talk to him in church parking lots with the same eyes people use at funerals. Eyes that are sorry for you. Eyes that need you to move on so they can. He couldn't. He had lost more than a daughter. He had lost the point of everything. So one summer morning, without ceremony, he packed up his photo gear, drove north out of Missoula, and didn't stop until the gas light blinked red. The mountains had always been there. He figured they still would be. He found an old ranger cabin for sale 4 miles from the nearest plowed road. Bought it with the last of his combat pay. Told no one. He stopped answering calls. Let his medical license expire. When his sister called, he let it ring until voicemail kicked in, then deleted it without listening. Will wasn't angry. He just didn't believe in what he used to. He didn't believe in healing anymore. The cabin became a kind of sanctuary, but not the peaceful kind. More like an exile that he chose because it didn't ask anything of him. It was where he could wake up and not be expected to fix what couldn't be fixed. He filled his time with routines. Chop wood, check traps he released what he caught, refill water tanks, photograph the wildlife from a distance. Grizzlies, moose, elk. Occasionally a black bear passes through. He never named them. He never fed them. He never got close. He didn't want anything depending on him. That changed when the mother grizzly came. The day after he stitched the cub's wound, Will stepped outside and saw the mother bear still there. Sitting, not pacing, not moving, just watching. He'd read enough wildlife biology to know this wasn't standard grizzly behavior. They don't wait around for thanks. They don't linger near humans unless injured or hungry, or unless they feel something is still unfinished. He didn't know what she wanted, but part of him wondered if maybe she didn't either. That morning, Will did something he hadn't done in a long time. He reached for his notebook. Not the medical kind, the personal kind. The one with Lily's drawings still taped to the inside cover. On the first blank page, he wrote one sentence. "I don't know what I'm doing, but I think I want to try again." He stared at the words for a long time. Then he put the notebook back on the shelf. Later that week, a delivery driver named Marcus brought supplies. Young guy, friendly, didn't pry, but noticed the scratches on Will's arms and the paw prints in the snow. "You got yourself a bear problem?" he asked, only half joking. Will smiled. More like a bear situation. That night, Will replayed that phrase in his head. A bear situation. No, it wasn't a problem. It was the first thing that had pulled him out of himself in years. It had structure, purpose, urgency. The kind of emotional gravity he'd spent a decade avoiding. And he was still afraid of it. Fear wasn't new to Will. He'd been afraid under fire. Afraid of holding the arterial clamp of a 19-year-old bleeding out. Afraid that when Lily coughed in her sleep the winter she got pneumonia. But this was different. This was the fear of allowing yourself to hope. Because once you allow that, once you believe something might still matter, you're opening yourself to the possibility of losing it again. He spent nights beside the cub reading her vitals, adjusting the heat lamp. He found himself talking aloud sometimes, not about much. Just the way people do when they're alone for too long and forget they're allowed to be heard. "You're a fighter, huh? Like your mom. Stronger than you look." Once he slipped and called her Lily, just once. Then sat in silence for a long time. You can't live in the past, but if you stay there long enough, your body forgets how to return. And the first step out is almost always terrifying. But sometimes it takes something innocent, something with no words, no history with you to remind you how to move again. In 2019, researchers at Montana State University tracked a female grizzly that returned to the same clearing every spring for 4 consecutive years. They called it a memory loop. She'd lost a cub there once. They couldn't explain it, said it was unusual for a bear to return without food motivation, but grief, it seems, isn't bound by species. Will didn't know that study, but each time he saw the grizzly mother sitting patiently near his fence, he wondered, is she watching me or watching herself? We often talk about rescuing animals, but maybe we should talk more about the animals that rescue us. The ones who walk into our lives carrying not just their pain, but a mirror to our own. The ones who remind us we are still capable of gentleness, still needed. Will didn't return to medicine that day. He didn't call his sister. He didn't shave or change much at all. But he started putting coffee in a second mug in the mornings, just in case someone came by. And that someone did. A week later, a woman in uniform knocked on his door. Carla Everett, wildlife enforcement, clipboard in hand, tone clipped, eyes trained on the grizzly outside like a scope. "Mr. Granger," she said, "we need to talk about the bear." Will held the doorframe a little tighter, because he knew somehow, even before she said it, that the world outside his cabin wasn't going to leave this miracle alone. She didn't leave. 3 full days after Will had taken the cub inside, the mother grizzly still hadn't gone. She camped out near the edge of the clearing, not pacing like a bear, anxious to flee, and not sleeping like a creature finally at rest. She just stayed, waiting, watching. Sometimes Will would glance out the cabin window and find her staring directly at the glass, like she was trying to see through it. Other times, she'd walk the perimeter of the clearing slow and silent, like she was tracing a line she couldn't cross. He'd seen grizzlies before, plenty of them during trail hikes through camera lenses in ranger reports. But this wasn't any grizzly behavior he'd ever read about. Grizzlies don't linger by humans unless they're desperate. And even then, desperation looks different. It's messy, loud, dangerous, but she was none of those things. She was calm, measured, like a sentry outside a hospital room, not a wild animal hovering near a predator. And maybe that's what haunted Will the most. He'd been a soldier once, a medic. He knew the posture of someone who refused to leave their wounded. And this bear, it wasn't grief she radiated. It was duty. Inside, the cub hadn't moved in hours. Juniper was still breathing. Barely. The fever had come overnight. Will noticed it by the way her ears twitched, not in reaction to sound but to pain. He adjusted the IV, cooled her with a damp cloth, whispered the kind of quiet encouragements that people only use when they're not sure anyone is listening. He wasn't even sure why he was whispering. No one else was around, except the bear and maybe the memory of Lily. By day 5, Juniper's breathing had gone shallow. Her leg, though stitched and clean, wasn't healing the way Will had hoped. Infection had set in deeper than he could see. He sat by her side that morning, steam rising from a mug he hadn't touched, and stared at her tiny chest rising and falling. Too slow, too uneven, a wave of helplessness crept in, old and familiar. It was the same feeling from the hospital 10 years ago, the one he'd buried beneath mountains and silence and frost. He reached out, gently pressed his fingers to Juniper's ribs, counting seconds, waiting for her to prove him wrong, praying to nothing in particular. Then something happened. The mother bear let out a sound low and steady from outside the cabin wall. Not a growl, not a warning. Something else, something smaller, quieter, almost like a hum. Will sat up straighter. She made the sound again, and this time Juniper stirred. Just a flicker, a twitch of the paw, a slight shift of the head. It was barely anything. But it was something. He didn't know much about vocal communication in grizzlies beyond basic warning calls and mating sounds. But this tone was different. It was consistent low frequency, almost like a purr. Not for intimidation, not even for communication in the typical sense. It sounded like a lullaby. Will leaned closer to the cub and whispered, "You heard her, didn't you?" The cub's paw twitched again. The next few hours passed like the edge of a storm. Not violent, but charged. Will monitored her vitals, changed out the IV bag, and sterilized the wound. Now and then the mother bear would emit the same soft rumble, and Juniper would respond subtly, slowly. By dusk, Will found himself stepping outside with a can of tuna in his hand, not as an offering. He knew better than to feed wildlife, but he needed her closer. She didn't move when he approached, so he knelt 10 feet from her and set the can down on the ground. Then he just sat. He didn't say anything at first, just breathed. Then quietly, "She's still with us." The bear blinked slow and deliberate. "You knew she was alive, didn't you?" he said. "That's why you brought her here." She didn't answer, of course, but her eyes, dark and wide, never left his. For a moment, the forest felt unusually, like even the pines were holding their breath. Grizzly bears are known for their ferocity and their protectiveness, but scientists have observed that mother bears develop strong bonds with their cubs, especially in the first 2 years. While most wildlife avoids any interaction with humans, extreme maternal stress can override instinct. And in rare cases, very rare animals choose proximity to people over the wild. Not out of weakness, but out of calculation. Will had read studies from Glacier National Park and Yukon Territory about bear behavior shifting due to environmental stress and trauma, but none of them explained what he saw. Now a wild grizzly showing restraint, watching a human tend to her baby and not reacting. This wasn't a fluke. It was a choice. In 2016, near Denali, a ranger documented a grizzly sow that remained near a wildlife rescue facility for over 2 days after being tranquilized and separated from her cub. Cameras caught her returning at night, pacing just outside the perimeter, always stopping in the same spot outside the pen where her cub was being treated. The ranger noted, this was no accident. She knew. It was called anecdotal, but to Will it was proof of something more. Instinct might drive survival, but love that runs deeper. We assume wild means disconnected, dangerous. But sometimes the wild simply reminds us what it looks like to stay close to the ones we love, even when they've been taken from us. And in that lesson, there's something deeply human, something painfully beautiful. Staying doesn't always fix the wound, but staying says you're not alone in it. Back in the cabin, Juniper's breathing evened out. Will leaned over her again, whispering the kind of things he used to tell Lily when she had a fever. You're doing good, baby bear. One breath at a time. Then, without realizing, he rested his palm over her small head. Her eyes fluttered, then opened barely, and for the first time they locked onto his. People like to talk about the intelligence of wildlife, tool use, memory, problem solving. But not enough is said about the emotional intelligence of animals. The capacity for presence, for patience, for bearing witness. This grizzly mother who had no reason to trust him had waited. Not hours, days, not demanding, not warning, just waiting. That Will realized is what real faith looks like. Not the belief that everything will be okay, but the choice to stay anyway. That night, as the wood stove crackled low and the air chilled near the windows, Will placed his chair next to Juniper's recovery bed and did something new. He opened his old satchel and pulled out the tattered field journal he'd once sworn never to write in again. He flipped to a clean page, and he wrote, "She waited." And I think I'm beginning to understand why. But not everyone was ready to understand. The next morning, a knock came at the door. Hard, official. Will opened it to find Carla Everett, clipboard in hand, radio on her belt, eyes scanning the tree line behind him. "Mr. Granger," she said with tight formality. "We've received multiple calls. Neighbors are concerned. We need to discuss the presence of a grizzly bear, specifically the sow who's been camped outside your cabin for nearly a week." Will stepped aside, gestured to the cub, resting in a crate near the stove, breathing gently. "She brought me her baby," he said softly, "and she's still waiting." Carla looked past him, her eyes falling on the small, fragile form wrapped in flannel and heat pads. And for a long moment, she didn't speak. Then she reached for her radio. The morning Carla Everett stepped into Will Granger's cabin, she didn't say much at first. She took off her boots by the door more out of instinct than courtesy and followed his gesture to where the cub lay swaddled in an old wool blanket, a heat lamp casting soft light across her fur. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and pine smoke. Every surface was occupied: gauze rolls, vet tape, used syringes, and notes scribbled on the backs of wildlife field maps. The stove clicked quietly in the corner, and a teapot hissed like it had something to say but didn't want to interrupt. Carla crouched down, hands on her knees. "She's stabilized," Will said softly, kneeling beside her. "Leg wounds healing? The fever broke last night, but she's not out of the woods yet." Neither of them spoke for a moment. The cub, Juniper, twitched in her sleep. Carla took in the makeshift recovery space, then looked at Will. "You were a medic," she said. "It wasn't a question." Will nodded. "Army," she continued. "Figured. You built this place like a field triage station." Will offered a small shrug. Old habits. Outside, the grizzly sow still lingered at the edge of the trees. She hadn't moved all morning. Carla stepped closer to the window and watched her, then turned back to Will. "We've had 4 calls this week," she said. "Neighbors, a couple of ranchers, one trapper. They're nervous. Say the bear's been circling too close." "She hasn't approached anyone," Will replied. "Not yet," Carla said. "But it's a grizzly. People don't see what you see." Will didn't argue. He'd lived long enough to know that fear spreads faster than facts, especially in towns like theirs, remote, close-knit, and wary of anything they couldn't control. And nothing says uncontrollable like a grizzly bear sitting calmly near your property line. By the end of the week, the whispers had grown legs. Nancy Wilkins, a retired postmaster who lived 3 cabins down, came by unannounced, flanked by her teenage grandson, Daniel. She didn't knock, just stood near the woodpile, arms crossed, waiting for Will to step outside. "Benjamin told us there's a bear camped out back," she said, not wasting time on greetings. "You planning to do something about it?" "She's not a threat," Will said. "Her cub's recovering inside. She's just waiting." Nancy narrowed her eyes. "You think that makes sense?" "Not really," Will admitted. "But here we are." She looked past him as if trying to spot the bear through the trees. Daniel, meanwhile, had his hand near the strap of his hunting rifle, too young to know fear and too old to take instruction quietly. Nancy stepped forward. What happens when she decides her cub's not coming back out? What happens when she panics? Will didn't flinch. "She won't." "You don't know that?" "No," Will said. "But I know what it looks like when something wild chooses peace instead of fear." "I'm looking at it." That night, Will found a flyer pinned to his door. "Warning, grizzly danger. Protect your family." Underneath, someone had scrawled, "If you won't do something, we will." The next morning, Will found Carla waiting on his porch again. "This town's scared," she said plainly. "They've been through enough," Will replied. "Fire, flood, closures. This valley's seen more loss than it knows what to do with. And sometimes people deal with fear by grabbing a weapon," Carla added. She didn't need to say who she was referring to. In small communities, wildlife is respected, but that respect often ends where property lines begin. Grizzly bears are especially controversial. Even though attacks are statistically rare, the fear they provoke is primal. That fear is passed down not unlike folk tales or local warnings. Never trust a bear near your livestock, or they don't think like we do. But what happens when one does? When a bear behaves in a way that doesn't match the stories. That's when things get complicated. Inside the cabin, Juniper had started trying to lift her head. She no longer whimpered in her sleep. Her breathing had normalized. She responded to Will's voice. He'd even caught her playfully batting at a scrap of fabric he'd dropped an old red bandana that once belonged to Lily. Will watched her grow stronger by the hour. But outside, the tension was mounting. It wasn't the bear that worried him. It was the people. That afternoon, while Carla made phone calls to Forest Service officials, Will walked into town. He stopped by the general store for iodine and gauze, tried to ignore the quiet stares. When he reached for his wallet, the clerk, a man named Reed, didn't look up. "She's still out there," he muttered. Will nodded. Reed handed him the supplies. "Just be careful, all right? Some folks are itching to prove something. Don't let her be the reason they do." That night, Will found himself sitting beside Juniper's bed, listening to the crackle of the stove. His thoughts were loud. He remembered Lily's hospital room, the oxygen machines, the sterile quiet. The way the nurses had kept their voices soft, even when there was no need to anymore. And here he was now sitting in another room beside another small body trying to survive. Only this time the world outside wasn't sterile. It was wild, angry, afraid. But somehow, the love felt the same. Healing doesn't always happen in places designed for it. Sometimes it happens in borrowed spaces, cabins, kitchens, or barns. And sometimes it happens in the face of collective fear. Not because the world is ready for it, but because it's needed anyway. When people talk about wilderness rescue, they often picture helicopters, rangers, high-tech tools. But some of the most important rescues happen quietly out of sight in places no one would think to look. A field hospital can be a FEMA trailer. A sanctuary can be a cabin in Montana. And a healer doesn't always wear a white coat. Sometimes he wears a threadbare flannel and doesn't speak unless he means it. By the end of the week, Juniper stood. It wasn't graceful. She wobbled, stumbled, fell, but she stood. Will watched her with quiet pride. The kind that doesn't need applause. The kind that just needs a moment to breathe. That night, as he refilled her water bowl, he looked out the window toward the trees. The mother was still there, still waiting, still choosing peace. But peace has a time limit, especially when fear is louder than facts. Especially when someone else is watching. Someone not from the valley, not from Montana, and not interested in the bond between a man, a cub, and a mother bear. Someone with power and a plan. The morning Juniper took her first few steps, it wasn't quiet. It wasn't magical. It was messy. She stood, legs trembling like birch twigs, took 2 stumbles, and fell flat on her side. Will didn't rush over. He just watched. Not because he didn't care, but because he knew better. Let her fail, let her try again. And she did. By mid-morning, she'd made it across the cabin floor to the woodpile. She collapsed next to it like a soldier finishing a long march, her breathing ragged but proud. Will chuckled, knelt beside her, and said softly, "You stubborn little thing." Outside the cabin, the mother bear hadn't moved much. She shifted her position, wandered short distances, but always returned to the same patch of earth. Watching, waiting, breathing like she was counting every exhale her cub made inside. Will understood that kind of waiting. By now, the cub's wound had closed. The infection had cleared. Her coat was growing back. She was eating, exploring, responding to Will's voice with little chuffs of acknowledgement. Her body had been saved, but something else wasn't right. It showed up in her eyes. She avoided her reflection in the low glass panel on the stove, shrank away from sudden sounds, wouldn't play with the bandana anymore. That had once been her favorite thing, batting it around like a kitten. But now, when she saw it, she backed into the corner. Will tried every trick he knew. Calming routines, slow introductions to new textures and sounds. He even brought in a field recorder and played forest sounds, real ones, just to ease her memory back into the wild. Nothing worked. One evening he sat beside her crate, resting a gentle hand on her back as she slept. The warmth of her breathing reminded him of when Lily would nap beside him on the old couch, book still open in her hands. Legs tangled in a blanket, the house filled with that sacred silence only a parent truly appreciates. Back then, he'd known what to do when Lily had a nightmare. He'd sit with her, hold her hand, whisper songs she barely remembered the words to. But this cub, this wild, wordless creature, needed something he wasn't sure he could offer. It wasn't just medical. It wasn't just shelter. It was safety. And she didn't feel safe yet. Animal trauma doesn't end when the wounds close. Just like people, wild animals can carry emotional injuries. Scientists studying wildlife rehabilitation often note behavioral changes long after recovery. Stress from traps, noise, even short-term separation from mothers can trigger anxiety, sleep disturbances, aggression, or fear-based withdrawal. Grizzly cubs are especially sensitive. Without consistent maternal presence, some never re-establish instincts. They survive, but they don't thrive. Juniper had survived, but she wasn't thriving. One afternoon, Will spoke with Carla, who had returned to check on them. "She's physically fine," he told her, "but emotionally, she's off. You can feel it in the room." Carla listened without interrupting. Then gently, "Maybe she needs her mother." Will looked down. "She's just outside." "No," Carla said. "I mean with her. The same way she was before. Touch, smell, familiar rhythm. There's something primal about that bond. Maybe she can't recalibrate without it." Will was quiet, then said, "I'm not sure I can be the one to give her back." That night after Carla left, Will made tea and sat in his old armchair. Juniper was curled near the stove. He didn't speak. He just watched the firelight dance across the cabin walls. It struck him that this wasn't the first time he'd tried to heal something beyond his ability. With Lily, it had been smoke and fire. Here it was silence and memory. In Yellowstone, a grizzly cub rescued from a wildfire was rehabilitated for months. She gained weight, healed physically, but when reintroduced to the wild, she wouldn't roam. Rangers noticed she circled the same small area for days, calling into the trees. Her mother had died in the fire. Without her, the cub eventually had to be relocated to a sanctuary where she could live safely but never re-enter the wilderness. It wasn't her body that failed her. It was the absence of what anchored her. One morning, Will saw the mother bear closer than ever. just 10 feet from the porch, sitting as still as always. Without thinking, he opened the cabin door. Juniper, hearing the door, woke with a start. She didn't run, but her ears shot up. Will took a slow breath, then stepped aside. Let her decide. The cub hesitated, took one step, then another. Will stayed silent. Juniper approached the open doorway, nose twitching, body trembling. And then from outside came that same low melodic rumble, the sound the mother had made during the fever. A vibration, not just a voice. Something that reached deeper than language. Juniper stepped outside. Will didn't follow. He just watched. The mother rose slowly and lowered her head. Juniper approached. They didn't rush. They didn't cry out. They just reconnected. The way things in nature do with patience. When their noses touched, Juniper released a long breath and collapsed into her mother's side like a fallen leaf returning to its tree. Will closed the door quietly. Sometimes healing isn't about fixing. It's about returning to touch, to memory, to the bond that makes safety real. We try to patch things with kindness, tools, and care, but some hearts only settle when they find their way back home. Later that night, Will sat at his desk and wrote in his field journal. I kept trying to fix something I never broke. She didn't need me to replace her mother. She just needed help surviving until she could return to her. He paused, then wrote, maybe that's what I needed too. We assume rescue is a solo act, one being saves another. But real healing is a relay. It's passing safety along, holding it long enough until the right hands arrive. Will didn't fail Juniper. He held the line until nature could take over, until instinct could finish what medicine began. We are not always the answer. Sometimes we're just the bridge. Juniper didn't stay forever. By the end of the week, she and her mother had moved on. Will spotted them once more climbing the ridge trail at dusk, silhouettes against an amber sky. He didn't feel sadness. He felt something cleaner, like air after a storm. But the quiet didn't last. Because a week later, a white SUV rolled into the clearing. Windows tinted. Emblem on the side, United Wildlife Liberation Foundation. The woman who stepped out had the calm of a lawyer and the resolve of a crusader. Clipboard in hand, orders in pocket, eyes scanning the cabin. She wasn't here to reunite anything. She was here to remove. The white SUV made no sound as it rolled over the gravel toward Will's cabin. It moved like it didn't belong. Polished, sterile, too quiet for this part of the Bitterroot. It stopped 10 feet from the porch. The engine shut off. Then nothing. Not even bird song. Will watched from the window. A woman stepped out. Tall, straight posture. Gray hair pulled back into a severe knot. Jacket zipped tight despite the mild weather. She carried a leather clipboard and the kind of presence that said, "This isn't a visit. It's an audit." "Dr. William Granger?" she asked, voice clipped but polite. Will nodded slowly, meeting her halfway across the yard. "I'm Evelyn Park," she said. "Director of Field Intervention at the United Wildlife Liberation Foundation." She extended a card, but he didn't take it. She continued. "We received multiple reports of inappropriate wildlife-human contact. Our organization intervenes in cases where animals, especially former service or high-risk species, are being kept outside the bounds of ethical recovery. You're on our list." Will raised an eyebrow. "I'm not keeping anything." The bear left. Evelyn flipped open her clipboard. "There's an indication you provided extended care for a juvenile grizzly without authorization. This includes administration of medication, prolonged human contact, and potential behavioral conditioning. These animals can't be safely rewilded after that." Will's jaw tightened. "She's already back in the wild. She wasn't a pet. She was dying. And you intervened," Evelyn said. "That makes her dependent." Will took a slow breath. "That cub came to me, or rather her mother brought her. I didn't chase them down. That doesn't change the outcome," she replied. "The cub was exposed to human behavior during a formative developmental window, Her responses have been altered. In our model that qualifies her as compromised. Will crossed his arms. And what does your model do with compromised animals? Evelyn didn't blink. We relieve them of further suffering. That was when Will understood. She wasn't here to relocate anything. She was here to end it. Inside the cabin still bore traces of Juniper's recovery blankets folded on the floor. A feeding dish tucked near the stove field notes scrawled on a spiral pad. Will didn't bother hiding it. He had nothing to hide. Evelyn scanned the room like a customs officer. Her gaze settled on a photo above the mantel lily, smiling at a wildlife sanctuary years ago crouched beside a fox. Will hadn't noticed how much the fox's ears resembled Juniper's until just now. You lost someone, Evelyn said, not unkindly. That much is clear. Will didn't respond. She walked toward the desk, eyes catching the open field journal. You're projecting, she continued. It happens all the time. People lose a child, or a partner, or a career. Then they find a broken animal and try to fix both at once. Still, Will said nothing. I've seen it 100 times, she said. But what begins as care turns into emotional dependence. The animal becomes an extension of grief. It stops being about healing them and becomes about healing ourselves. That's not wildlife rescue. That's therapy, and animals can't consent to being our therapy. Organizations like Evelyn's operate to protect wildlife from the long-term harms of human interference. The logic is rooted in science. Wild animals need to remain wild. Prolonged exposure to humans, especially during early development, can create imprinting where animals begin to associate safety, food, or security with people. In the case of bears, this often ends with relocation or euthanasia. But what science doesn't always factor in is intent or mutual choice. Will poured tea without asking if she wanted any. Set one mug in front of her anyway. She ignored it. He leaned forward. Juniper wasn't looking for a trainer or a therapist. She was looking for time. Her mother brought her here because something in her knew this place wasn't dangerous. She stayed because she could feel I wasn't trying to own her. Just give her space to breathe. Evelyn tilted her head. And how do you know that? Will gestured toward the stove. She left. Evelyn didn't answer. Instead, she pulled a manila envelope from her bag and placed it on the table. These are signed orders from the Forest Service's Third-Party Authority Division. Your case qualifies for immediate intervention. If we locate the cub or her mother within a 10-mile radius, we are legally permitted to tranquilize, remove, and euthanize if necessary. Will felt his chest tighten. They're gone, he said. For their sake, I hope you're right. She was halfway to the door when something made her pause. A small piece of paper had fallen from her clipboard. She reached for it, then froze. It wasn't paper. It was a letter, folded yellowed at the edges. Will saw her hand tremble slightly. He stepped forward. What is that? Evelyn swallowed. It's nothing. He said nothing, just waited. She opened it. Inside a short, handwritten message. Mom, if anything happens to me, I want you to know Rex was more than my partner. He was my reason to believe people were worth it. Don't forget that. Don't let them forget either. Will watched her face shift, rigid lines, softening eyes flickering with something she hadn't let rise in a long time. She folded the letter carefully, slower this time. It was my son's, she said quietly. He was K9, SAR. New Mexico unit, died in a flood rescue. The dog died next to him. They said he drowned trying to pull my son out from under a collapsed bridge. Will listened. After that, she said, voice thin, I made it my mission to stop people from making animals sacrifice themselves for our chaos. Our grief. I wanted to spare them what Rex went through. Will nodded slowly, but maybe Rex didn't see it that way. In one of the most documented cases of canine loyalty, a service dog named Max stayed with his handler after a vehicle accident in Alaska. Max refused to leave the crash site for 2 days, howling when rescuers tried to pull him away. When they finally reached the body, they found Max lying across it, ribs bruised but alive. The family insisted Max had chosen to stay because loyalty to him wasn't pain. It was love. Sometimes the line between devotion and suffering isn't ours to draw. Grief can twist love into control. It can take something sacred and turn it into a rule, a policy, a list of things to avoid. But when we project our pain onto others, especially the innocent, we risk robbing them of their agency. Healing doesn't mean erasing the past. Sometimes it means allowing others to choose what we couldn't. Evelyn stepped away from the door, her shoulders lowered. "You said the cub is gone." Will nodded. "She's free." Wild, the way she was always meant to be. Evelyn took one last look around the cabin. At the blanket, the empty water bowl, the field notes. Then she said softly, "You did more right than most people ever do." She tucked the court orders back into her folder. "I'll report no sightings," she said. "You won't hear from us again." Sometimes the fiercest defenders of rules are people who've lost the most. Their rigidity isn't cruelty, it's armor. But love, real love, the kind between a dog and a handler, a bear and her cub, or a grieving man and a wild creature, has a way of slipping past armor, reminding us that sometimes what we're trying to prevent is the very thing that made us feel alive. Evelyn stepped back into her SUV. Didn't start the engine right away. She sat there for a few minutes holding the letter, then quietly drove away. Will watched until the dust settled. The clearing was quiet again. The stove ticked softly. He sat down at the desk and reopened his journal. Some things can't be fixed, but they can be witnessed, and maybe that's enough. But the story wasn't over. That afternoon, a knock came at the cabin. Not a ranger, not a neighbor, it was a teenage boy. Face-smudged eyes, wide arms wrapped around something small. "I heard you help animals," he said. He held out a bundle wrapped in a hoodie. A fox kit, shivering, bloodied, breathing. Will stood aside. "Come in." The boy's name was Miguel. 14, thin, hands too steady for someone that young. The kind of quiet that didn't come from shyness, but from seeing too much too early. The fox kit had been hit by a truck on the edge of Route 3. Miguel had wrapped it in his hoodie, walked 5 miles, and stood on Will Granger's porch without knocking. "I didn't know where else to go," he said. Will opened the door wider. "You came to the right place." The fox, small and shivering, had a broken hind leg and a gash across its ribs. Will didn't ask why Miguel had been near the highway or how long he'd been walking. He could see the boy was holding it together with the same kind of threadbare hope he used to carry himself. He laid the fox gently on the table, the same table where Juniper had once clung to life. And for a long moment, Will just stood there looking at the boy and the creature in front of him, remembering. This time he didn't hesitate. Word spreads differently in small towns. Not like wildfire, more like wind it carries in corners, whispers through trees, passes from hand to hand, until it feels like it's always been there. The grizzly was gone, but the story wasn't. People started showing up. Not just to ask questions, but to help. It began with Mrs. Martinez, who brought clean towels from her church's donation closet. She stayed to sweep the porch. Then Reed, the general store owner who used to avert his eyes, dropped off a new bottle of antiseptic and didn't say a word. 2 days later, Nancy Wilkins, the same woman who once threatened to call in hunters, came with a box of canned goods and a wool blanket. "I heard you took in a fox," she said. "Figured you'd need supplies." Will raised an eyebrow. She added, "That bear, she wasn't what I expected." "And you weren't either." By the end of the week, Will's cabin looked less like a hermit's hideout and more like a wildlife triage center. Miguel started coming by every morning without being asked. He learned how to mix rehydration fluid, how to gently clean wounds, how to log temperature changes. He didn't say much, but his hands learned fast. One afternoon, Will handed him a small spiral notebook. "Start tracking vitals," he said. "If we're going to keep doing this, we need records." Miguel's face didn't change, but his hands held the notebook like it meant something. When communities witness acts of compassion, especially toward animals, it can rewire fear into empathy. Research from conservation psychology shows that direct exposure to wildlife, especially through storytelling or rehabilitation, reduces hostility and increases support for protection efforts. The grizzly didn't just change one man. She reminded a whole town what was possible when trust replaces fear. One evening, Will and Miguel stood in the clearing behind the cabin. A deer grazed near the far edge. The fox was resting inside, out of danger, healing fast. Miguel looked up and asked, "Do you think she'll come back?" Will didn't need to ask who he meant. "Maybe," he said. "But I don't think she has to." That fall, something new happened. People started bringing animals. A farmer with a lamb tangled in barbed wire. A woman with a hawk who couldn't fly. A kid who'd found a nest of abandoned baby raccoons in an old barn. They didn't ask Will to fix everything. They just asked if he'd take a look, if he knew what could be done. Each time Will opened the door, each time Miguel was already preparing the table. In a nearby town, a school principal invited Will to speak at an elementary classroom. He didn't want to go, but Miguel talked him into it. Will brought photos, told the story of Juniper, showed them her old paw prints pressed into mud outside the cabin. One student raised her hand and said, "So, the bear was just like a mom." Will nodded. Exactly like a mom. The kids started writing letters to the grizzly, thanking her for trusting humans. Some of them drew pictures. He kept them in a folder by his bed. Sometimes it takes the presence of something wild to bring people back to what's real. Nature doesn't care about our divisions, our routines, our rules. It invites us back into connection if we're brave enough to listen. And sometimes healing doesn't look like medicine or therapy. It looks like trust. It looks like choosing to stay. It looks like a bear who waits for days outside a stranger's door and teaches a town how to care again. People often ask what wild animals teach us. But maybe the more important question is what we remember when we meet them. We remember we're not alone in our grief. We remember that instinct isn't always violent, it can be patient. We remember that loyalty doesn't require words, and that love, the real kind, often comes without conditions, only presence. The fox recovered. They released her at the edge of the national forest under a rising moon. She trotted into the dark without looking back. Will and Miguel stood side by side, not saying anything, just watching the trees close behind her, like a curtain falling after a quiet play. "Do you think she'll remember us?" Miguel asked. Will smiled. "I hope not." Miguel frowned. "Why?" "Because that means she'll be too busy being wild." Later that year, a retired vet from Bozeman called to donate equipment. A local carpenter offered to help build a small shed behind the cabin for the overflow, he said with a grin. Will didn't argue. They built it together in 3 weekends. Miguel stained the wood by hand. They called it the Granger Refuge, though Will insisted on no signs, no website, just a place to help creatures who couldn't help themselves until they could. In Alaska, a similar initiative began after a wildlife biologist informally treated an injured lynx. Locals began bringing animals. A movement followed. Eventually, a full sanctuary formed, funded not by grants, but by hand-built donations, community potlucks, and word of mouth. Sometimes the most impactful legacies aren't created through institutions, but through stories, shared by people who were there when something wild walked into their lives. One morning, Will opened the door and found a new face. A girl, maybe 10, stood holding a cardboard box with holes poked in the top. "I found a squirrel," she said, smiling nervously. "He fell from the roof. My mom said you help things get better." Will crouched beside her, looked at the box. "You did the right thing bringing him," he said. "Let's see what we can do." In a way, the grizzly never left. Her lessons lived in every knock on the door, every child who asked how to splint a wing, every neighbor who once feared bears but now brought carrots for recovering rabbits. She came looking for help, but she left behind something bigger: legacy. The first snow arrived early that year. Will stood on the porch watching flakes settle onto the logs. Miguel leaned against the railing sipping cocoa. "You ever miss her?" the boy asked. Will nodded. "I think about her all the time." "Me too." They didn't say her name. They didn't have to. They never planned to give it a name. It was just the cabin at first, then the place with the bear. Eventually, people started calling it the refuge. But it was Miguel who said it best one afternoon while checking on a limping raccoon someone had left in a fruit crate. He looked around at the patched windows, the supply shelves full of gauze and peanut butter. The new sign someone had carved out of old barn wood. "I think this is a place for second chances," he said. Will didn't say much, just handed him the water dish, but the words stayed. Years passed. The cabin changed. So did Will. There was still no sign out front, still no business hours, but somehow people always knew where to come. They showed up with turtles, owls, foxes, cats, and black bear cubs separated from their mothers. One woman drove 3 hours with a golden eagle wrapped in an old quilt. Will remembered the way she held it in her lap, like a sleeping child, whispering the whole ride. He never asked how she'd found them. The ones who needed healing always found their way. The Granger refuge, if you had to call it anything, became more than a place. It became a rhythm. Kids started showing up with notebooks wanting to learn. Retired folks brought blankets. Rangers dropped off injured animals between their shifts. A retired nurse built a quiet corner where people could sit with the animals just to be near something breathing. Even those who once questioned Will now stopped by with thermoses of soup updates from town or small envelopes marked for feed. The grizzly never returned. Not physically, but her presence never left. It hung in the stillness before the snow, in the calm around a newborn fawn's eyes, in the way Miguel, now older, placed his hand just above an animal's heart before beginning care. The cubs she brought had taught them all what it meant to trust again. Grizzly bears are rarely associated with human healing, but this story isn't about domestication, it's about respect. About one animal's choice to place her cub in the hands of a stranger, and one man's decision to answer that trust with action. It's a story rooted in biology, but moved by something deeper, interspecies connection. In wildlife rehabilitation, the science is clear. Success isn't just measured by survival, it's measured by return. The goal is always for the animal to re-enter the wild with dignity. What happened at Will's cabin was exactly that. Survival followed by release, healing followed by freedom. But alongside that, something else healed too. People. In Oregon, a woman named Clara launched a small wildlife rescue center in her garage after helping a wounded coyote. Years later, she said the animals weren't the only ones being rehabilitated visitors. Volunteers, even Clara herself, experienced quiet healing in the daily acts of care. "They don't ask you for words," she said. "They ask you to show up." That's it. Will understood that. The grizzly never asked him for comfort. She asked for space, for stillness, for a chance. One winter morning, Miguel hung a new wooden board near the porch. It simply read, "Second chances happen here." A young girl, no more than 8, looked up at it and asked Will, "How many animals have you saved?" He didn't answer right away. Then said, "I don't count the ones I save. I count the ones that remember how to live." Studies in trauma psychology, human and animal, have shown how healing environments share certain traits. Consistency, quiet, and the absence of pressure. Wildlife, especially sensitive species like foxes, raccoons, and bear cubs, recover best when given minimal stimulation, clear boundaries, and care offered without force. And humans, we're not so different. At the refuge, Will didn't speak much, but his silence was a kind of permission. You don't have to be okay yet. You're allowed to be broken for a while. Not every pain needs to be fixed. Some just need to be witnessed. Some wounds don't close with stitches. They close slowly through kindness, repeated until it becomes muscle memory again. A boy with no one left brought a dying fox. A town full of suspicion brought blankets, time, and trust. A grizzly brought her baby. And somewhere in all that, a man found himself again. One evening, Miguel asked Will a question he hadn't expected. They were cleaning out the small storage shed behind the cabin, sorting supplies, checking expiration dates. "Do you think she knew what would happen when she brought Juniper here?" Will paused. "The grizzly?" Miguel nodded. Will leaned on the doorframe, thought for a while, then said, "I think she didn't need to know. I think she hoped." Miguel looked down at the box of bandages. "Is that what you did when I showed up?" Will smiled. "Exactly. We live in a world that often values speed solutions and certainty. But wild animals don't work that way, and neither do broken people. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do for a person or a creature is simply not to leave. That's what the grizzly taught them. She waited, not because she was tame, not because she was weak, but because she believed. She believed that healing might still exist in a world that had taught her to run. And that belief became the foundation of something lasting. One day, years later, a letter arrived. No return address, just a note inside, handwritten, smudged at the edges. "I don't know if you remember me. I'm the woman from the Foundation. I wanted you to know I still carry that letter from my son, and I think he would have liked what you built. I know I do." Will placed the note in the same folder where he kept the kids' drawings, field reports, and the first photo he ever took of Juniper curled beside the stove. Sometimes the most unexpected lives become the ones we remember most. Not because they roared, but because they stayed. Now it's your turn. What has stayed with you? Maybe it wasn't a grizzly on your porch. Maybe it was a cat who never left your side when you were sick, a dog who sensed your sadness before anyone else, a bird outside your window singing at just the right moment. Whatever it was, whatever creature wild or domestic reminded you of your place in this world, remember that. Maybe it didn't fix everything, but maybe it reminded you that you were still worth saving. If this story stirred something in you, if it made you remember someone, some animal, or some moment when you were seen, I'd love to hear about it. Drop your story in the comments. Subscribe if you want more quiet, powerful stories like this one. And if you believe in second chances, hit like. Because the world may not always be kind, but kindness, like a grizzly in the woods, sometimes finds us anyway. One quiet step at a time.